critical views of Beijing. Aside from the attacks, many of which have not been solved, other complaints about press freedom centre on issues like self-censorship and personnel changes. These complaints generally do not allege that the legal right to press freedom in Hong Kong is being challenged, but rather that journalists or media outlets known to criticise Beijing are increasingly facing problems like the withdrawal of advertisers, abrupt and unexplained sackings of outspoken management or editorial staff, and denial of applications to renew broadcasting licences.
I'm listening with great attention to my honourable friend's speech, and what she has said we all deplore. But wouldn't we be rather naive to believe that China, controlled by the Communist Party and determined to keep its dictatorship, is going to allow in Hong Kong freedom of expression and the democratic rights which we all would wish to see?
However, these rights, the point I was making at the beginning, was of course these rights are enshrined in law, and therefore they are breaking the law if these rights are being violated. These issues, of course, are creating a climate in which press freedom is respected according to the letter of the law, but journalists are being pressurised by advertisers and media owners to avoid criticism of Beijing or being denied platforms from which to make such criticisms. And the rise of the Chinese-owned media in Hong Kong, in tandem with China's more general economic growth, also plays a role in debates over press freedom. Reporters Without Borders, in their annual report, drew attention to this, saying China's growing economic weight is allowing it to extend its own influence over the media in Hong Kong, Macau and Taiwan, which had largely been spared political censorship until recently. Media independence is now in jeopardy in these three territories, which are either special administrative regions or claimed by Beijing. So the situation is, I would say, for press and broadcasting freedom to be dire. And the FCO's six-monthly report on Hong Kong, covering July to December 2013, included a section on press freedom and freedom of expression, noting there were some concerns that these freedoms are under threat. I think that is rather too mild. The FCO concluded that these rights were generally well respected, but detailed a number of controversies, particularly relating to press freedom. In their six-monthly report of January 2002 to June 2014, the FCO similarly listed several incidents of controversy or demonstrations relating to concerns in Hong Kong about perceived infringements of press freedom, and noted that people in Hong Kong appeared to be increasingly worried about self-censorship. However, it noted that in April, the chief executive had spoken in support of press freedom because it was a cornerstone of a free society. The FCO did not take a particular stand on the specific concerns it mentioned, stating, "We believe that freedom of expression, including of the press, has played an important role in Hong Kong's success. It is one of the fundamental freedoms protected by the Joint Declaration. As such, we take seriously concerns about press freedom, including fears about self-censorship. We welcome the Chief Executive's clear statements on press freedom, and we will continue to monitor the situation closely." Well, of course, as the Chairman has said, our report our investigation is going to continue, but I would hope that the Chinese government is listening to the points being made in this debate and will think again, as it did 26 years ago when it recognised it had made a mistake by excluding three of us visiting China at that particular time. Thank you.
Sir Malcolm Rifkin, Mr. Speaker, I pay tribute to my right honourable friend, the chairman of the Foreign Affairs Committee. Central to the concern that the House is expressing is whether the United Kingdom can be reasonably accused of interfering in the internal affairs of China. I was privileged to serve as Foreign Secretary for the final 2 years of British sovereignty over Hong Kong, and I was involved personally in the final stages of these negotiations. If it was the situation that the British government was trying to deal with, or committee was trying to comment on matters that were not relevant either to the joint declaration or the basic law, then of course you could have a complaint, a legitimate complaint, that these are the internal affairs of China. But the question of the franchise in Hong Kong goes to the very heart of the joint declaration and the basic law. And the chairman of the committee was of course entirely correct to say that the suggestion that these commitments and the right of the United Kingdom government, indeed not just the right, the obligation of the United Kingdom government to take an interest in the fulfilment of these commitments expired when sovereignty transferred to Hong Kong is patently absurd. We have only seen 17 years pass of the 50 years for which these obligations are indeed a commitment of the Chinese government. It was an international agreement reached with Her Majesty's government, and it is, as I say, an obligation, not just an entitlement, not only for the British government, but also for the committees of this House to monitor these matters and to express their views on that. May I also say that I think, and I say it in a very genuine sense, I think the Chinese government have done themselves a disservice by the step they have taken. What they have demonstrated is not their strength, it's their weakness. Because the idea that by simply issuing a veto on visas, that somehow resolves the issue, simply has not happened. Quite rightly, I understand the committee is going to continue its work, and all that has happened is some very adverse publicity for the Chinese government in a way that they could so easily have avoided. They should have welcomed the Foreign Affairs Select Committee. They should have used it as an opportunity to put to them their point of view, explaining that under their own proposals there will be a mass franchise, and explaining their justification as to why they believe the selection of the candidates should be under their control. Whether they would have persuaded the committee, of course, we cannot say one way or the other, but that is how they should have operated. But when I say they've done themselves a disservice, they've done themselves a disservice in a much wider sense than simply the implications for Hong Kong. Because part of the reason for the original commitment by Deng Xiaoping to two systems in one country was not just to find a solution for the issue of Hong Kong, but infinitely more important from the point of view of Chinese policy and Chinese national aspirations is whether Taiwan will one day agree to rejoin the motherland. And central to the Chinese government's position ever since Deng Xiaoping has been to try to reassure the people of Taiwan and the government of Taiwan, which is itself now a democratic government with a pluralist system and with the rule of law, that their way of life would not be endangered by some agreement at some stage to peacefully rejoin the People's Republic of China, to join with China under the People's Republic. Now, of course, the controversies that are convulsing Hong Kong at the moment do enormous damage to the credibility of the Chinese government's ability to put forward that argument. They should realize that, and indeed it is astonishing that they still persist in the policy that we are debating today. Central to these issues is not just the question of democracy in Hong Kong, but also the rule of law. And the rule of law, of course, is not just about the number of political parties or the candidates or free elections. We all understand what the rule of law means. There was a very fascinating speech made by the current leader of China and a policy that was implemented by the People's Congress just a few weeks ago, when it was declared by the Chinese government that the priority objective for the immediate future was that the rule of law in China, but they described it in a specific way. They said China would be utterly committed to the rule of law with Chinese characteristics. A very interesting qualification. I remember in the days of the Soviet Union, when people referred to not just democracies, but people's democracies, you knew the very addition of that word was in practice a negation of the democracy itself. Once you start having to qualify democracy, it is an excuse to try and justify ignoring it. So when we are now committed to, in China, the rule of law with Chinese characteristics, it's worth asking what actually are these characteristics. Well, I have a reason to think I do know what they mean, and I would like to share it very briefly with the House. When I was Foreign Secretary, one of the obligations I had was to have a series of negotiations with the then Chinese Foreign Minister, Chen Chi-chen, about the handover of Hong Kong to the People's Republic. And I remember vividly one meeting I had with him in Beijing, when I was saying to him that from the point of view of the people of Hong Kong, what was important to them when they became part of China was not simply that they would have elections and pluralist political system and so forth, important, very important though that was, but also that they would continue to enjoy the rule of law. Now, I knew what I meant by that, and this House would know what I meant by that, but I've never forgotten his response. The Chinese Foreign Minister said to me, "Oh, please don't worry, Mr. Rifkin. We in China, we too believe in the rule of law. In China, the people must obey the law." So I had to point out to him that when we talked about the rule of law and the people of Hong Kong, it wasn't just about the people obeying the law, it was about the government obeying the law. That the government itself had to be under the law, it had to be an independent legal and judicial system. And it was manifestly clear that the then Foreign Minister of China not only didn't agree with me, he hadn't the faintest idea what I was saying. He could not understand that distinction. And we see it elsewhere. We see it in Putin's Russia at the moment. That governments make laws, therefore, if they don't like it, they can just either ignore it or change it with impunity. And that is a very serious matter. Can I conclude my comments simply by saying this? It is now 17 years since the transition. I think we have to acknowledge that in many fundamental respects, Hong Kong does remain very different from China. Compared to the rest of the People's Republic, it is, in comparison, an open society and a relatively free society. And I think we should commend the Chinese government for the extent to which they have indeed carried out not just much of the letter, but a significant amount of the spirit of the commitment, because otherwise Hong Kong wouldn't be the open society it still remains today. But this House, as well as the world as a whole, is conscious that these distinctions are being eroded. And in the short term, the situation is rather grim if the Chinese government is determined to nibble away wherever it can to the freedoms that the people of Hong Kong enjoy and are entitled to continue to enjoy. In the medium to longer term, the difference between China and Hong Kong and the rest of China, will erode. It will erode, but not in the direction the current Chinese government would like. It won't be by Hong Kong becoming more like China. In the longer term, it will be by China becoming more like Hong Kong. Because already the pressures within China for a more open society, for a more pluralist system, for some choice in the election of their leaders, is becoming very, very significant. And already, to be fair, the Chinese government have experimented in some local elections with allowing more than one candidate and a real element of choice, albeit in a very restricted way. The final point I make is simply this. The Chinese government's current assumption with regard to pluralism and democracy and the rule of law is somehow that may suit the West, but these are Western values, not Chinese. The evidence which discounts that, which shows it to be worthless as an argument, is not what happens in the West. It is a look at the transformation of Taiwan. It's a look at Hong Kong itself, and to a significant degree to look at Singapore, all Chinese communities that not only talk about democracy but practice it, that practice pluralism, that have independent judicial systems, and that clearly corresponds to the wishes of the people whom they govern. So these are universal values that we're talking about. And I think the chairman of the Foreign Affairs Select Committee and the members of that committee have done a great service, not just to this House, but to Hong Kong and to China as a whole, by opening up this debate in the way we are able to do today.
Sir Gerald Gortman.
Mr. Speaker, I hope the House will forgive me if I don't remain throughout this debate. I have other commitments, but I very much wanted to be present for this debate. I was present in Hong Kong at the handover from the United Kingdom to the Chinese government. I remember that Prince Charles gave a party aboard the royal yacht Britannia, but there was nothing to celebrate, Mr. Speaker. I was there when, in an auditorium, Chinese troops goose-stepped along the stage, hauled down the Union flag and hoisted the Chinese flag. And I regarded it as a day of shame for Britain. There was never any obligation to hand over Hong Kong to China.
Chris Patten, when he was governor of Hong Kong, belatedly tried to stop it, but by then it was too late because the then government had decided that that was what should be done, and I have absolutely no doubt that it was Foreign Office officials abiding by their usual custom of ingratiating themselves with a foreign government with which we could have valuable trading relations when democracy was the second consideration. We have seen, of course I shall give way to the Honourable Gentleman.
I thank him for giving way, and he makes the point about trade. China is looking to deploy enormous amounts of capital in Europe, and clearly a lot of investment is taking place in the UK, which I welcome. However, could he say what more could be done to impress upon the Chinese government that these sort of incidents do ultimately hit business confidence, and they need to get over this because, you know, we want to see more investment from China in Europe?
The problem is that, and again it will be the Foreign Office and it will be other government departments like the Department for Business who say, oh, in the end, human rights in China and, of course, in Hong Kong are secondary to the fact that China is now an immense economic power and very important trading partner. And that's the problem. The problem is that the days when morality dictated foreign policy have diminished, and it is very, very important indeed for us to understand what is going on there. I remember, and I made a very great mistake, when I led a Labour Party delegation, when I was Shadow Foreign Secretary, when I led a delegation to China, I said to the leaders of the Chinese Communist Party that if they wanted to be a capitalist country, which they clearly did, then they would have to abandon autocracy and adopt democracy. And I could not have been more wrong, because they have managed it. They have managed to create a capitalist economy while not having a democratic society. And this is a very important moment, and it's a very important moment in terms of our relationship with Hong Kong and the government, and I pay tribute to many of the things that have been said at Foreign Office questions today, for the government to take into account the fact that although, of course, trade is very important indeed, and jobs are very important indeed, morality is also very important indeed, and we should stand up for it. And when we look over the years, I've got a painting in my house of the gate to Tiananmen Square. When we look at what has happened in China, we ought to be more realistic about it. Okay, if we're going to be brutal and say trade matters more than anything else, then that's a point of view and that's a policy. But let us take into account that China is a country which has the death penalty, which it uses whenever it feels inclined to do so. It tortures, it imprisons without trial. There was a program on television about an artist who was imprisoned for painting the wrong paintings. It imprisons without trial. There is no genuine freedom of speech. It interferes whenever it feels inclined with the social media. I'm not saying we can transform all of this. Of course we can't. This is what's happening. The day may come when China, like the Soviet powers, suddenly becomes a democracy. I hope I'll live to see it. But it's very, very, very important for this House to register its anger at what has taken place, the insult to the Foreign Affairs Committee, and therefore the insult to this House of Commons, Mr. Speaker. I'm grateful to you for calling to me, because I did not wish this to go by without stating my experience and stating my views.
Yeah. Sir John Stanley.
Mr. Speaker, I'm glad to follow the excellent opening of this debate made by my right honourable friend, the member for Croydon South, as chair of the committee. I've been a member of the Foreign Affairs Committee since 1992, and Mr. Speaker, you were entirely correct in stating, in giving your most welcome consent to this debate yesterday, that the situation we face is entirely unprecedented. And the Foreign Affairs Committee, during the long period in which I have been privileged to serve on it, has never ever before been refused entry to any country worldwide. And this is a very dangerous precedent for other committees in the House, as the Right Honourable Gentleman, the Chair of the Home Affairs Committee, has already pointed out, and to the House as a whole. I have to say that in a previous visit to China in the last Parliament, we were subject to threats and a degree of intimidation. We were subject to threats trying to deter us from going to Tibet. And I was privileged to lead the group of the committee that did eventually go to Tibet, and we faced down those threats and attempts to intimidate us. And at the end of that visit, we faced further intimidation and threats from the Chinese authorities when they found out that we were going from mainland China to Taiwan. And that very difficult situation was admirably handled by the then chair of the committee, the member for Ilford South. And again we faced down the Chinese authorities and we went to Taiwan as planned. But this is an unprecedented situation, and one which is, I'm sure we would regard in all parts of the House, wholly unacceptable. What the Chinese are seeking to achieve by barring the Foreign Affairs Committee from going to Hong Kong, I have to say, escapes me. As the chairman of the committee has made clear, we are not going to be deflected from our inquiry. We shall be continuing our inquiry. We shall continue to take evidence, including from people in Hong Kong, which we are of course perfectly capable of doing without actually going to Hong Kong, and we shall be making our report to the House in due course. In political terms, the Chinese authorities, in my view, have scored a spectacular own goal. In political terms, they could not have given more eloquent credence to the case being made by the pro-democracy demonstrators in Hong Kong that the joint declaration is under threat. They could not have made it more clear by the way in which they have dealt with the House of Commons Foreign Affairs Committee. But notwithstanding that, the issue of how the British government responds is, in my view, of key importance. I have to say to my right honourable friend, the Minister of State, and to my right honourable friend, the Foreign Secretary, I have thus far been very disappointed with what I have seen in the public domain from the Foreign Office in their response to the situation in which this House and the Foreign Affairs Committee have been placed. All that I have seen is that they have said that the Chinese authorities' response and ban on the Foreign Affairs Committee is, open quotes, regrettable, close quotes. That, in my view, is nothing like good enough. The House, democracy in this country, had been treated with contempt, and I hope the Minister of State will give us a more robust response when he ends this debate. Thank you.
Mike Gates.
Speaker, it is, as always, a great pleasure to follow the Right Honourable Member for Tunbridge and Malling. He will recall that I, as a newly elected member of this House, joined him on the Foreign Affairs Committee in 1992. And I can remember many visits in my time as a member of the Foreign Affairs Committee to many different countries over the years, where we might have had some issues about who we were able to meet. We might have had some issues about the exact timings of visits, but never, ever, whether in Russia, whether in Iran, whether in Saudi Arabia, whether in Pakistan, whether in Afghanistan, or indeed in China, were we ever told, you are not welcome to come, and we will stop you or prevent you getting off the aircraft. And it's not, some members have referred to the question of visas. It's not a question of visas. UK citizens do not need visas to go to Hong Kong. The Hong Kong government determines its own internal arrangements. Yet, we have the people in Beijing and their diplomatic representatives in London telling us that we are not welcome in Hong Kong. And that is clearly a breach, as the chairman of the committee so ably put it, a breach of the undertakings given by the Chinese to the people of Hong Kong and to our representatives in the negotiations that led to the joint declaration. And I have to say, it's been said that why are they doing this? I suspect, and it really surprises me, they must be afraid that the presence of a handful of British parliamentarians is somehow going to change the internal dynamics in Hong Kong and China. They must be very, very nervous and very worried. What's happening in Hong Kong is not being broadcast in Chinese media. You can see it covered in the rest of the world, you can see it in Taiwan. But the Chinese authorities have rigorously censored communications about events in Hong Kong. Just as when the people of Hong Kong protest on the anniversary of the massacre in Tiananmen Square, not a word of it is broadcast by the Chinese state authorities. This is an indication of the Chinese regime being prepared to use ruthless power because they are afraid. And I think it augurs very badly for what might happen in Hong Kong in coming weeks and months. I don't wish to spend too long talking about that, but I did want to talk about the issues related to Parliament and the committee's inquiry. I go back to the previous time we visited China. In fact, in May 2006, the last Parliament's Foreign Affairs Select Committee, which I had the great honour to chair, we went to Hong Kong, and then we went from there to Beijing, and then the group split into two. One group went to Tibet, to Lhasa. Another group, which I led, went to Shanghai. And then we met up again in Hong Kong and went to Taiwan. And one of the interesting episodes, and the Right Honourable Member has just referred to it, was the meeting we had with Foreign Minister Li Xiaojing, who was very pleasant to begin with, asked me how Margaret Beckett, the member for Derby was, as the Foreign Secretary South, thank you Mr Speaker, was how she was doing, because he'd had discussions, amicable discussions with her